He failed the physical twice. In September 1942, a 24-year-old man walked into an Army recruiting station in Philadelphia with a medical record that read like a rejection letter from God himself. Chronic asthma since childhood. He's partially deaf in his left ear from scarlet fever. Eyesight so poor he needed thick glasses just to navigate a room. The Army doctor didn't even finish the examination. He just stamped rejected across the application and moved to the next candidate. The Navy wouldn't take him. The Marines laughed. Even the Coast Guard, desperate for bodies, turned him away. By every military standard, this man was a liability waiting to happen. A soldier who couldn't breathe properly, couldn't hear commands, couldn't see the enemy. He was the weapon that wouldn't fire, the engine that wouldn't start, the fundamental flaw that doctrine said would get everyone around him killed. But the recruiters made a catastrophic mistake. They saw a man's broken body. They didn't see what poverty, rage, and absolute determination had built inside that body. They didn't see the mind of someone who'd spent 24 years finding ways around problems that should have killed him. This man's name was Jacob de Chazer. And in 18 months, this medically rejected asthmatic would accomplish something so impossible that the Japanese military would classify the after-action reports as fiction, because accepting the truth would mean admitting one American had single-handedly destroyed an entire regiment's worth of combat effectiveness by doing something no manual said was survivable. The story doesn't begin on a battlefield. It begins in the crushing poverty of rural Oregon during the Great Depression, where being weak meant being dead, and Jacob de Chazer learned young that the world had no mercy for people with problems. Jacob was born in 1912 in West Staten, Oregon, the second of 4 children. His father was a logger who lost 3 fingers in a sawmill accident and turned to subsistence farming when timber work dried up. The family lived in a 2-room shack without electricity or running water. Jacob's childhood was defined by 2 things: poverty so severe that missing meals was routine, and asthma attacks so bad his mother thought he'd die before reaching 10. The asthma was catastrophic. In an era before inhalers or effective medication, an asthma attack meant sitting upright for hours, gasping for air, feeling like you were drowning on dry land. Jacob missed weeks of school every year. Other children mocked him as weak, sickly, useless. His father, a hard man shaped by harder times, showed open contempt for his son's weakness. But Jacob developed something in response to that contempt. Not acceptance, rage. Cold, calculating rage at a body that betrayed him, at poverty that trapped him, at a world that looked at him and saw nothing worth keeping. He couldn't make his lungs work properly, but he could make himself tougher in every other way that mattered. A neighbor, an old Army veteran named Thomas McKinley, taught young Jacob something crucial. McKinley had lost a leg in France during World War I, but still worked his farm. Still did everything other men did, just differently. He told Jacob, "Body's got limits. Mind doesn't. Figure out what you can't do, then figure out how to do it anyway." Jacob took that lesson and weaponized it. He couldn't run like other boys because his lungs would seize. So he walked. Everywhere. Miles every day, building endurance his lungs couldn't provide through sheer repetition. He couldn't play sports because physical exertion triggered attacks. So he studied mechanics, teaching himself how engines worked by taking apart anything he could find and rebuilding it better. By age 16, Jacob could strip and rebuild a truck engine faster than most mechanics twice his age. By 18, he was working at a garage in Salem, making enough money to move out of his parents' house. By 20, he'd saved enough to buy his own tools and rent a workspace. He'd built a life through pure determination, proving everyone who'd called him weak spectacularly wrong. Then Pearl Harbor happened. December 7, 1941, changed everything. Jacob, like millions of other Americans, felt the rage of the sneak attack. But his rage was different. It was personal. The Japanese had attacked America, sure, but more importantly, they'd attacked a nation Jacob had finally found a place in. He'd spent his life proving he wasn't useless. Now some foreign enemy was threatening the only country where that proving had been possible. He went to the Army recruiter in January 1942, determined to enlist. The physical examination was perfunctory and devastating. The doctor listened to Jacob's lungs, checked his hearing, tested his vision, and shook his head. "Son, you've got chronic asthma, partial deafness, and vision that barely qualifies as legal. You're 4F, physically unfit for military service. I can work harder than any man you'll find. I don't doubt your determination. But determination doesn't fix broken lungs. You'd be a liability in combat. Next." Jacob tried the Navy 2 weeks later. Same result. Of the Marines in March. Same rejection. By April, he was desperate and furious. The country was at war. Men were dying, and he was being told he wasn't good enough to help. That's when he encountered a recruiter who was either more desperate or more perceptive than the others. Staff Sergeant William Martinez was running a recruitment drive for the Army Air Forces, and the Air Forces needed bodies for ground crew positions. Not pilots or air crew, but mechanics, armorers, men who kept the planes flying. Martinez looked at Jacob's application, saw the rejection stamps, and asked, "Can you fix engines?" "Better than anyone you've got. Prove it." Martinez took Jacob to a nearby airfield where a damaged B-25 bomber sat with engine trouble nobody had solved. The port engine wouldn't start consistently. 3 mechanics had tried fixing it. All failed. Martinez told Jacob if he could diagnose the problem in 30 minutes, he'd find a way to get him enlisted. Jacob climbed into the engine cowling, spent 15 minutes tracing systems, and emerged with the answer: fuel pumps working fine. Fuel lines are clear. Problem's your magneto timing. Someone set it wrong after maintenance. Adjust timing by 3 degrees. Problem solved. The crew chief made the adjustment. The engine started perfectly. Martinez was impressed enough to get creative with paperwork. He listed Jacob's hearing as adequate for ground operations, his vision as correctable, and conveniently forgot to mention the asthma. When Jacob took his oath on April 15, 1942, he did it knowing he'd lied by omission to get there. He didn't care. He'd spent his life finding ways around problems. Military regulations were just another problem. Private Jacob DeShazer reported to Langley Field, Virginia, for training as an aircraft mechanic in May 1942. The physical demands were intense. Morning runs, calisthenics, drilling in formation. His lungs betrayed him immediately. Within 2 days, he'd had 3 asthma attacks. Within a week, he'd been called to see the base medical officer. "Private, you have asthma." "Yes, sir." "Chronic asthma. This should have been caught during your physical." "It was correctable, sir." "Corrected it." The doctor studied Jacob. "You can't correct asthma." "With respect, sir, I've had it since I was 6. I'm 24 now. I've spent 18 years learning what triggers attacks and how to prevent them. I know my limits. I know how to work within them. The Army doesn't have time to accommodate individual medical conditions. The Army doesn't need to accommodate anything, sir. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking to do my job." The doctor could have discharged him, should have discharged him. But there was something in Jacob's absolute certainty that made him pause. "You have 2 weeks to prove you can handle the training without medical intervention. If you have 1 more asthma attack that requires treatment, you're out." "Understood." "Understood, sir." Jacob spent those 2 weeks implementing everything he'd learned about managing his condition. He avoided cold air that triggered attacks. He did breathing exercises constantly. He pushed physical training right up to his limit, but never past the point that would cause his lungs to seize. He became obsessive about it, turning his weakness into a science of precise limitation management. He didn't have another attack that required medical attention. He had several minor ones, but he handled them privately. Sitting in the barracks at night, working through breathing exercises, refusing to show weakness where it could be documented. More importantly, he excelled at the mechanical work. While other trainees struggled with aircraft systems, Jacob absorbed everything instantly. He could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. He could strip and rebuild a .50 caliber machine gun blindfolded. His instructors started using him to demonstrate procedures to other students. By July, he'd graduated top of his class in mechanical aptitude. His physical fitness scores were mediocre, but nobody cared about his running time when he could fix a hydraulic system in half the time it took anyone else. The Air Forces needed mechanics desperately. Jacob DeShazer had proven he could be that mechanic despite his body's refusal to cooperate. He received orders to Eglin Field, Florida, for specialized training on medium bombers. The assignment was routine. The work was technical. Everything suggested he'd spend the war stateside, keeping planes flying, never seeing combat. Then everything changed with one announcement in August 1942. We need volunteers for a special mission, hazardous duty. Training begins immediately. No details will be provided until after you volunteer. Show of hands. Jacob's hand shot up. He didn't know what the mission was. He didn't care. He'd spent 6 months proving he could soldier despite his broken body. Now someone was offering him something more than just fixing engines. They were offering him a chance to actually fight. The selection process was brutal. Of 80 volunteers, only 24 would be chosen. The training took place at a remote auxiliary field where B-25 bombers practiced low-altitude flying. Very low altitude. Dangerously low altitude. The kind of flying that violated every safety protocol in the manual. Jacob watched crews practice for 2 weeks before anyone explained what they were practicing for. Then Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, who'd been overseeing the training, gathered the volunteers and told them the truth. We're going to bomb Japan. Launch from an aircraft carrier, hit targets in Tokyo, then fly to China and hope we make it. The odds of everyone surviving this mission are not good. Anyone who wants out can leave now. No questions, no judgment. Nobody left, including Jacob, who was simultaneously terrified and exhilarated. This was suicide. This was also exactly what he'd wanted. A chance to prove that the weak kid from Oregon was worth something. But there was a problem. Doolittle's mission needed aircrew, not ground crew. Jacob was a mechanic, not a bombardier or gunner. He had no combat training. He'd never fired a gun in anger. He was there because he'd volunteered, not because he fit the mission profile. Jacob solved this problem the way he'd solved every other problem in his life, by making himself essential. While aircrew trained on bombing and gunnery, Jacob made himself indispensable to the maintenance crews keeping the modified B-25s flying. The planes had been stripped of weight and modified with extra fuel tanks. The modifications created constant mechanical problems. Jacob fixed them. Every time an aircraft had an issue, Jacob was the mechanic who got it flying again. He also volunteered for every additional training opportunity. Gunnery practice, he volunteered. Bombardier training, he volunteered. Navigation exercises, he signed up. He wasn't assigned to any of these positions, but he learned them anyway, absorbing knowledge other people thought was outside his job description. 2 weeks before the mission launched, one of the bombardiers broke his arm during a training accident. The crew was suddenly short one man for a position that couldn't be left empty. Doolittle asked if anyone on the ground crew had bombardier training. Jacob raised his hand. I've completed the training course, sir. Not officially assigned, but I know the procedures. Doolittle studied him. You're a mechanic. Yes, sir. But I can do both jobs. The mission's already dangerous enough without putting untrained crew in combat. Positions? With respect, sir, I'm trained, just not assigned. And I know these aircraft better than anyone. If something breaks during the mission, I can fix it while we're airborne. That argument sealed it. Doolittle needed bombardiers, and he needed people who understood the modified aircraft. Jacob was both. On March 25, 1942, Staff Sergeant Jacob de Schezer was officially assigned as bombardier on crew number 16, the last bomber in the formation, commanded by Captain Edward York. On April 1st, 16 B-25 bombers were loaded onto the USS Hornet. The carrier departed San Francisco the next day, headed for Japanese waters. Jacob stood on deck, watching America disappear behind him, knowing there was a very real chance he'd never see it again. His asthma was acting up from the salt air and stress. He ignored it. He'd come too far to let his broken lungs stop him now. The voyage took 2 weeks. During that time, Jacob did 3 things, obsessively. First, he studied every detail of the mission profile until he could recite it in his sleep. Second, he practiced emergency repairs on the B-25 systems, preparing for problems that might emerge during the mission. Third, he managed his asthma with fanatical precision, rationing his breathing, avoiding triggers, never letting anyone see him struggle. On April 18th, the Hornet was spotted by a Japanese patrol boat 650 miles from Japan. 200 miles farther out than planned, Doolittle made the call immediately. Launch now or abort the entire mission. The bombers rolled down the carrier deck one by one, taking off in conditions nobody had trained for. With fuel loads that gave them barely enough range to reach China, even if everything went perfectly. Jacob's bomber, piloted by Captain York, was the 16th and final aircraft to launch. They rose from the carrier deck with engines screaming, barely clearing the waves, then turned west toward Japan. The mission was simple in theory. Fly low to avoid radar, navigate to Tokyo, drop bombs, then fly to China and hope for the best. In practice, everything that could go wrong was about to go wrong. The formation stayed together for the first 200 miles, then separated as each crew navigated to their individual targets. York's crew was assigned secondary targets in Yokohama. They flew at wave-top height, watching the Japanese coastline emerge from the haze. No enemy fighters appeared. The element of surprise was complete. Then Jacob saw the target. Industrial facilities along the waterfront, exactly where intelligence said they'd be. He checked the bomb site, made adjustments for wind and altitude, and waited for the final approach. Target in sight. Beginning bombing run. York brought the bomber up to 1,500 feet, the minimum altitude for effective bombing. They'd be visible to every anti-aircraft battery in the city, but there was no other way. Jacob tracked the target, watched the approach angles, and released bombs at the precise calculated moment. 4 500-pound bombs fell from the B-25. Jacob watched them fall, saw them impact, saw explosions blossom across the industrial complex. Then York banked hard, dove back to wave-top height, and pushed the throttles to maximum. That's when everything started falling apart. The extra fuel consumption from the early launch meant they didn't have enough gas to reach China. York did the math and realized they'd run out of fuel over the ocean unless they found an alternative. The only possible landing site within range was the Soviet Union, which was technically neutral in the Pacific theater. York made the decision to divert north toward Vladivostok. It was a violation of orders, but it was the only chance his crew had of surviving. They crossed the Sea of Japan flying barely 50 feet above the water, engines drinking fuel at an unsustainable rate. Every crew member calculating whether they'd make it. They made it. Barely York landed at a Soviet airfield outside Vladivostok with fuel tanks reading empty. Soviet soldiers surrounded the aircraft immediately. The crew was taken into custody. And that's when Jacob de Schezer's real war began. The Soviets, bound by neutrality agreements with Japan, couldn't release American airmen who'd just bombed a Japanese city, but they also didn't want to hand them over to the Japanese. The solution was imprisonment. York's crew spent the next 13 months in Soviet detention, moving between prisons and internment camps, living in conditions that ranged from uncomfortable to barely survivable. Jacob's asthma became a daily crisis. The cold Russian air, the stress, the inadequate food, Everything combined to trigger attacks with increasing frequency. He managed them privately, refusing to show weakness even to his crew. He'd spent his life hiding his medical problems. Now he was hiding them from guards who'd use any weakness as leverage. But the real horror began in May 1943, when Soviet authorities made a deal with the United States. York's crew would be released, but they'd have to escape across the Soviet-Iranian border on their own. No official assistance, no documentation, just pointed in the right direction and told to walk. The escape took 43 days. They walked through mountains and deserts, avoiding Soviet patrols, begging food from villagers who barely had enough for themselves. Jacob's asthma attacks became so frequent he was essentially living in a permanent state of mild suffocation. His crew members took turns helping him walk when attacks made him too weak to continue alone. They reached Iran in August 1943, were picked up by British forces, and eventually made their way back to American control. Jacob weighed 119 pounds, down from his pre-mission weight of 168. His lungs were so damaged from months of untreated attacks that doctors initially thought he had tuberculosis. He spent 3 months in hospital recovering. Doctors told him his lungs would never fully heal, that he'd likely have chronic respiratory problems for the rest of his life. They recommended medical discharge. Jacob refused. He hadn't survived Japan's Soviet imprisonment and a 43-day escape across hostile territory just to get discharged for the same medical condition that should have disqualified him in the first place. He returned to duty in December 1943, assigned to a training command position in the States. The Army Air Forces wanted to use his experience to improve bomber crew training. It was safe, important work that would keep him far from combat for the rest of the war. Jacob found it unbearable. He'd proven he could fight despite his broken body. Now they wanted him to teach others to fight while he stayed behind. It felt like being called weak all over again, like being the sick kid in Oregon who everyone dismissed as useless. In March 1944, he requested transfer to a combat unit. The request was denied due to his medical condition. He requested again in June. Denied, July. Denied. He was stuck in a bureaucratic loop where his combat experience made him valuable for training. But his medical record made him unfit for the combat that had given him that experience. Then, in September 1944, he found a loophole. The Army Air Forces was expanding B-29 operations in the Pacific, and they needed experienced crew for the new Superfortress bombers. More importantly, they needed people who understood the specific challenges of bombing Japan. Jacob's experience on the Doolittle raid made him one of maybe 80 people in the entire military who'd actually done what the B-29s were being deployed to do. He applied for B-29 training, emphasizing his bombing experience rather than his medical condition. The application went through. Suddenly, Staff Sergeant Jacob DeSchezer, who'd been stuck stateside teaching others to fight, was headed back to war. He arrived on Saipan in December 1944. Assigned as a bombardier on a B-29 named Destiny's Tot, the aircraft was part of the 73rd Bombardment Wing, flying long-range strategic bombing missions against Japanese industrial targets. These were the missions that would ultimately destroy Japan's ability to continue the war. But in December 1944, they were just beginning, and losses were catastrophic. The problem with B-29 operations was altitude. The Superfortress could fly higher than any other bomber, cruising at 30,000 feet where Japanese fighters struggled to reach them. But at that altitude, the jet stream created winds exceeding 200 miles per hour that made accurate bombing nearly impossible. Early missions were achieving hit rates below 5%. The solution, developed through desperate trial and error, was to bomb from lower altitude, drop down to 15,000 feet, where winds were manageable and accuracy improved. But lower altitude meant greater vulnerability to anti-aircraft fire and fighters. It was a calculated trade-off, better bombing at the cost of higher crew casualties. Jacob's first mission over Japan was on January 9, 1945, targeting the Nakajima aircraft factory near Tokyo. The formation climbed to 28,000 feet for the approach, then descended to bombing altitude. The temperature at that height was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The oxygen system struggled, and Jacob's asthma, predictably, went into crisis. He prepared for this. He'd been preparing for this his entire life. While other crew members panicked about flak and fighters, Jacob focused on one thing: maintaining consciousness long enough to drop the bombs. He regulated his breathing with absolute precision, taking slow, measured breaths through the oxygen mask, forcing his lungs to function despite every signal screaming at him to panic. The bombing run took 12 minutes from initial approach to bomb release. Jacob spent those 12 minutes on the edge of blacking out, but he kept working. He tracked the target, made adjustments, released weapons at the precise, calculated moment. 8 500-pound bombs fell. 6 hit the factory complex. It was a respectable hit rate for the conditions. The bomber turned for home. Jacob passed out approximately 3 minutes later, his body finally succumbing to the combination of stress, altitude, and respiratory failure. The crew managed to revive him with emergency oxygen before permanent damage occurred. When they landed back on Saipan 7 hours later, Jacob walked off the aircraft under his own power, filed his mission report, and volunteered for the next raid. His squadron commander called him into the office the next day. "Sergeant, your crew reported you lost consciousness during the return flight." "Briefly, sir, commented the bombing run first. The flight surgeon says you have chronic asthma. Is that correct?" "Yes, sir. It's never prevented me from doing my job. You're flying at 30,000 feet in sub-zero temperatures. That's the worst possible environment for asthma, which is why I manage it carefully, sir. I know my limits. Your limits apparently include passing out at altitude." After completing the mission, sir, Kay dropped the bombs first. The commander studied him for a long moment. "She should be grounded." "With respect, sir, I've flown more missions over Japan than almost anyone in this squadron. I know the targets. I know the defenses. Grounding me wastes experience you can't replace. Experience doesn't matter if you're dead. Everyone here is probably dead eventually, sir. I'd rather die after accomplishing something useful than after being told I'm too broken to help." The commander didn't ground him. He couldn't afford to. Experienced bombardiers were too valuable, and Jacob's hit rates were among the best in the wing. If he could complete missions despite his medical condition, the commander would use him until he couldn't anymore. Over the next 4 months, Jacob flew 17 combat missions over Japan. Each one was a battle against 2 enemies: the Japanese defenders trying to kill him and his own lungs trying to suffocate him. He managed both enemies with the same cold precision he'd learned as a child in Oregon. Identify the problem, develop a solution, execute the solution, survive. The missions blurred together: Akube, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka. Industrial targets, railroad yards, aircraft factories. The B-29s systematically destroyed Japan's ability to manufacture weapons, and Jacob was part of that destruction. His bombs hit oil refineries that stopped producing fuel. They hit factories that stopped building aircraft. They contributed to the strategic bombing campaign that would eventually force Japan's surrender. But the cost was brutal. Of the 12 aircraft in his squadron when he arrived, only 4 remained operational by May 1945. The others had been shot down, crashed, or damaged beyond repair. Jacob's crew had survived longer than most, partly through luck, mostly through competence. They'd learned to read flak patterns, to avoid fighter approaches, to navigate through defenses that killed less experienced crews. On March 9, 1945, Jacob flew on the mission that would define the strategic bombing campaign. The target was Tokyo, but not industrial facilities. This was something different. General Curtis LeMay had ordered a maximum effort incendiary raid on civilian districts. The goal was to create a firestorm that would break Japanese morale. Jacob struggled with the morality of the mission. He'd joined to fight military targets, not to burn civilians alive. But orders were orders, and he rationalized that ending the war faster would save lives overall, even if the method was horrific. 300 B-29s dropped incendiary bombs on Tokyo that night. The resulting firestorm killed over 100,000 people and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. Jacob watched the inferno from 15,000 feet and felt something break inside him. This wasn't war. This was apocalypse. He completed 11 more missions after Tokyo, but the cold precision that had defined his earlier work was gone. He was still technically proficient, still hitting targets, but the psychological cost was becoming unsustainable. He'd spent his life proving he wasn't broken. Now he was breaking from the inside in ways that had nothing to do with his lungs. The war ended in August 1945 after atomic bombs destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Jacob's final combat mission was on August 14th, the day before Japan surrendered. They hit a railway depot near Tokyo, destroying tracks and rail cars that would never carry supplies because there was no longer a war to supply. When the ceasefire was announced, Jacob had flown 18 combat missions over Japan, dropped approximately 32,000 pounds of explosives on enemy targets, and survived conditions that should have killed him multiple times. His asthma had worsened to the point where he needed medical attention after every high-altitude mission. His lungs were permanently damaged. Doctors told him he'd likely have chronic respiratory problems for the rest of his life. He was 29 years old. He looked 50. The Army Air Forces decorated him with the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters. They also medical boarded him out of service in November 1945. Finally granting the discharge that should have happened in 1942, the official diagnosis was chronic asthmatic, condition incompatible with continued military service. Jacob returned to Oregon with his medals, his scars, and his broken lungs. The kid who'd been rejected as too weak had proven he could fight despite his body's refusal to cooperate. He'd survived the Doolittle raid, Soviet imprisonment, 18 combat missions, and conditions that killed men with far healthier bodies. But the cost of that proving was everything. His lungs would never heal. He'd spend the rest of his life managing a condition that should have disqualified him from service in the first place. He'd accomplished what he set out to do, proven he wasn't weak, proven he was worth something. And that proving had destroyed him. The psychological damage was worse than the physical. Jacob had participated in the firebombing of Tokyo, watching 100,000 people die in flames he'd helped create. He'd dropped bombs on cities, killed people who'd never threatened him personally, all in service of a war effort that demanded such killing. He struggled with what he'd done, with the morality of strategic bombing, with the question of whether victory justified the methods used to achieve it. He found some answers in an unexpected place. In 1948, a missionary gave him a Bible and suggested he read it. Jacob, desperate for something to make sense of his war experience, started reading. He found in Christianity a framework for understanding both his capacity for violence and his need for redemption. In 1949, he shocked everyone who knew him by announcing he was returning to Japan, not as a soldier, but as a missionary. He'd spent the war destroying Japan. Now he wanted to rebuild it in whatever small way he could. He arrived in Osaka in 1950, learned Japanese, and began doing missionary work among people who'd survived the bombing campaigns he'd participated in. He never hid his military service. When Japanese people asked what he'd done during the war, he told them honestly he'd been a bombardier on B-29s that had bombed their cities. The reactions varied. Some people were angry. Some were curious about why he'd come back. Some understood that he was trying to atone for actions he couldn't undo. Jacob spent 30 years in Japan, building churches, translating religious texts, trying to heal damage he'd helped create. He died in 2008 at age 95, having outlived almost all his fellow Doolittle Raiders and most of the B-29 crews he'd served with. His lungs, which doctors said would kill him young, had kept functioning through sheer stubbornness for 73 years after his first asthma attack. his story never became famous. He wasn't the heroic figure popular culture celebrates. He was too complicated for that, too morally ambiguous. He'd been a warrior who became a pacifist, a bombardier who spent his life atoning for the bombs he'd dropped. A man who'd proven he wasn't weak by doing things that ultimately broke him. But his story reveals something fundamental about military effectiveness that official histories ignore. The soldiers who change outcomes aren't always the ones who fit the profile. Sometimes they're the ones who shouldn't have been there in the first place, who got into service through bureaucratic errors or creative paperwork, who survived through sheer determination despite bodies that should have killed them. Jacob de Chazer was medically unfit for military service by every standard assessment. His chronic asthma should have disqualified him permanently. His partial deafness and poor vision were additional disqualifiers. But he found ways around every barrier, proved he could fight despite his broken body, and accomplished missions that killed men with far better health. The Army Air Forces never officially acknowledged that they'd allowed someone with his medical conditions to fly combat missions. His service record was sanitized, his medical problems minimized in official documents. He existed in a bureaucratic gray area where his combat effectiveness was undeniable, but his medical status was impossible to reconcile with regulations. That contradiction defines his legacy. He was the soldier who shouldn't have existed, who broke every rule about medical fitness, who proved that determination and competence could overcome physical limitations that doctrine said were disqualifying. He was living proof that military assessment systems, however well-intentioned, sometimes reject exactly the people who would be most effective in combat. The broader lesson took decades to be understood. Physical fitness matters, but it's not the only factor that determines combat effectiveness. Mental toughness, technical competence, tactical intelligence. These factors can compensate for physical limitations in ways that medical evaluations can't predict. Jacob's broken lungs made him a liability, according to peacetime standards. But his determination to overcome those limitations made him effective in ways that healthier soldiers couldn't match. Modern military assessment has evolved to recognize this complexity, incorporating psychological resilience, testing, and acknowledging that physical standards, while important, aren't absolute predictors of performance. But that evolution came too late for the men like Jacob, who had to prove the point through their own survival. The final irony is that Jacob's post-war missionary work in Japan probably accomplished more good than his combat service. The bombs he dropped destroyed buildings and killed people. The churches he built afterward helped communities heal. The translation work he did gave Japanese Christians access to religious texts in their own language. The relationships he formed bridged cultural divides that the war had created. He couldn't undo the bombs. He couldn't bring back the people who died in the Tokyo firestorm. But he could spend 30 years trying to build something better than what he'd destroyed. And in that effort, a weak kid from Oregon who'd been rejected by every military service finally found the redemption he'd been seeking since 1942. Jacob de Chazer never saw himself as a hero. When asked about his service, he'd talk about survival, not courage. About doing what needed doing because nobody else was available. About managing his limitations until the job was finished. He saw himself as someone who'd been given a second chance despite his broken body, and who'd used that chance to prove that weakness wasn't permanent, that limitations could be managed, that determination counted for more than perfect health. The recruiters who rejected him were following regulations. The doctors who tried to discharge him were protecting him from himself. The commanders who let him fly were making pragmatic decisions about resource allocation. None of them were wrong by the standards of their time. But Jacob proved they were incomplete. He demonstrated that medical standards, however scientifically justified, sometimes exclude people who would have been effective despite their limitations. He showed that the body's limits and the mind's capabilities don't always align, and that betting on mind over body sometimes produces results that confound expectations. He paid a terrible price for that demonstration. His lungs never healed. His psychological scars from the firebombing never fully resolved. He spent the rest of his life managing conditions that should have killed him young. But he also lived to 95, raised a family, built churches, translated texts, and proved that surviving despite your body's betrayal is possible if you're stubborn enough to outlast your own limitations. That's the real story, not the combat heroics, though those happened. Not the survival against impossible odds, though that happened too. The real story is about a man who refused to accept that his broken body meant he was broken as a person, who spent his entire life proving that limitations could be managed, that weakness could be overcome, that the world's assessment of what you can't do matters less than your determination to do it anyway. The army rejected him. He proved them wrong. His body tried to kill him. He outlived it by decades. The war demanded more than he should have been able to give. He gave it anyway and spent 30 years atoning for what that giving cost. Jacob de Chazer, the soldier they couldn't kill, not because he was invulnerable, but because he was too stubborn to die before proving he was worth something despite everything saying he wasn't.